If you don't know, has anyone been to the Hub before? Has anyone not been to the Hub? Well, welcome. This is the Brewer Family Entrepreneurship Hub. This is a resource available to all U of A students, so access to this space to be able to study, meet with teams or groups, so welcome. Today I'm really excited to introduce Nicholas. Is it Samer?
Samer.
Oh, I got it right. Okay, so Nicholas Samer. I have a few bullets I'm going to read about him, just to give you some context to who he is, although I'm sure he'll tell you more. So Nicholas leads client partnership and brand strategy across North America for Saatchi and Saatchi X. He spent his career working in the world of agencies, startup, and brand management. He believes that great solutions demand both left and right brain thinking. Nicholas genuinely loves developing talent and helping his teams achieve career and personal success. And when he's not working, you'll most likely find Nicholas somewhere out in the woods with his wife Angela and their two boys, Ewan and Luke. I got him the second try.
That's good.
So help me in welcoming Nicholas.
Thank you all. It's really good to be here. This is a topic that I love talking about, and I think is super fascinating. So I hope you all do as well. So the context that I'm going to be talking about is I'm going to talk to you all like you either are part of a startup or you have a startup in mind, or you're just interested in that field. But I'm curious. I'd love, not everyone has to introduce themselves, but I'm curious why you guys came. Just a couple people and how this may relate to what you are doing. And hopefully this is an interactive evening with lots of discussion. So
I've got an idea for a startup that I'm hoping to potentially pursue down the road.
Awesome.
I'm in a class right now where we are doing startups.
Okay.
And as a finance major, I don't have much marketing experience. So
Awesome. Well, very, very good. Anyone else? Anyone like not doing anything with a startup? You just
I'm a supply chain manager, just checking out marketing.
awesome. Maybe we can pique your interest. Well, here's what we're going to do as far as kind of what we'll go through. So I think the first thing, and possibly the most important thing for you all to take away that I want to communicate, is that branding is so much more than what meets the eye. There's so many elements that go into building a brand and sustaining a brand. So we're gonna dive into that a little bit. We're actually going to talk a little bit about the biology of branding and the way our brains function. So are there any neuroscience majors? That's really good because I will probably botch some things as I talk about it. So I can talk about it in context of a marketer. We're going to talk about how you actually go about building brands. We'll look at a case study on what's the value of actually having a brand. And then when you all need to start thinking about it, we're going to talk about how to get design help. So if you're at that point where you're like, I know we need to create some branding, but I don't know any designers, I don't know any graphic design majors, who can I go to? So we've got something for that. And then we're going to do a little bit of a working session where I hope it gives you something that you can walk away with, something very tangible that you can say, okay, I know this is my product and the idea I have, and here's one thing I can do to start thinking about what my brand will look like. So Rachel said some kind words. Thank you. This is my wife, Angela, and my two boys, Luke and Ewan. I love what I get to do, but so much more important than what I do for work is my family. So I just wanted to start off with a quick picture of them. So from a career perspective, let me give you just a quick background. So I actually got my undergrad in digital media and cinematography. And then I was either going to go to film school or go to business school, and I actually decided I'd rather go to business school because in my mind there was more opportunity for creativity. And there was also some more opportunity for revenue and income. So, but I think business, you just have unlimited connections, unlimited opportunities of what you can do. And out of grad school, I started working at Saatchi and Saatchi X. So this would have been back in 2005. And I got to work with Procter & Gamble, and I got to learn like how really big brands operate in the world. And we at Saatchi X are specifically focused on shopper marketing, like what actually is communicated in store. But I was really fascinated in what happens before a product gets to the store. Like what are those engineers thinking about, like when they're developing the product? How do they get to that brand message? So I left and I went and worked for Mars Pet Care. And I ran a brand called Greenies and some of their other care and treats brands. And this allowed me to truly work on everything from identifying opportunities in the marketplace. I got to spend a lot of time with the engineers and the R&D folks developing products all the way through the consumer advertising. After that, I came back to Northwest Arkansas, worked at a startup called Acumen Brands. We were a startup, and we started up, and then we stopped in 2015. Lots of great experiences there. And then I came back to Saatchi, where I've gotten to continue to help our organization develop its understanding of brands and how we work with our clients, from Wendy's to Keurig. We still work with Procter & Gamble. So a lot of the first part of this presentation is going to be in context of big brands, but I promise we will make the leap to smaller brands and startups. So one other comment, if you guys have questions, just raise your hand. Like, this is going to be more fun if it's interactive and a discussion. So through these experiences, I came to one key realization as a marketer, is that the best marketing is actually a good product. So the branding part is really fun, the marketing part is really fun, but if you want to have great marketing, you have to focus your energies on your product. And I'll loop back to here at the very end to this comment. So what is a brand? What do you guys think a brand is?
An identity.
An identity?
Yeah, something that people recognize.
Yep.
Tied to the product.
Any other thoughts? What a brand is? So I would argue that a brand is any sort of stimulus that drives a recall. So anyone know what this is? What campaign this is?
The Dos Equis guy?
Yep. So what do you think of, like, when you see his picture?
Immediately Dos Equis.
Yeah, the first, when I see his picture, the first thing that comes to mind is the song from the TV campaign. But I would argue and I would contend that part of branding is well beyond a logo or well beyond a spokesperson. So it could be the wax on Maker's Mark bourbon. It could be the bottom of, I'm gonna say this wrong, Louboutin shoes that are red. Like, you don't even have to see a logo. You don't even have to see a full bottle. You don't even have to see the full wax mold. Like, if you are in that category, you will recognize what those things are. So it can be the grill on a car. It could be an architectural style. I appreciate architecture. I don't know a lot about it, but I know that people who are into it, they recognize Frank Lloyd Wright, or they recognize an Eames chair. So these are all things that intentional or not, like, drive that recall, stimulate that recall for consumers. In fact, some brands do it so well that you can literally just see a color or a stripe, or you can see the brand actually presented wrong and know what the brand is. I assume everyone knows what that is over on your left. Those elements, those stimulus, are super critical to developing a powerful brand that people remember and people associate meaning with. So powerful that, like, one of our clients is Tide, and they have a very specific orange color that whenever we print something at a printer, we actually send someone to do a press check they have an exact copy of what the Tide orange looks like, and when stuff starts coming off the press, it's got to match that color exactly. And if it doesn't, it gets reprinted. Like, that's how serious, like, it is that these companies keep these elements consistent. So this is an element that a lot of marketers and a lot of companies actually don't realize, is that your brand is, as much as it is about driving recall or driving an awareness, it's really integral to driving your product innovation and where your company is going as a whole. And it's probably easiest to showcase this by showcasing some examples of companies that have done this poorly. Does anybody know what kind of car that is? It's Cadillac. So it's the same body style that General Motors used. I think it was for the Chevy Beretta, or some Chevy and Pontiac back in the 80s. And Cadillac tried to launch their product in this body style, and it very quickly failed. Colgate literally tried to launch frozen meals, and we all know how much, like that's exactly that taste. It quickly bombed. Everyone knows about Coke and the reformulation. What's really interesting about this, that goes to this idea that you need to be focused on product, is from a branding perspective, it wasn't an issue. It was the taste that was absolutely revolting to people. It was the product itself that drove the big issue. And then last, Coors Rocky Mountain Sparkling Water. I mean, they've got the Rockies. They tap the Rockies right there. Like, why not launch a water? Well, clearly there's a reason why this stuff is not working. And these companies, I know that Cadillac launched another small car in the late 90s that also quickly failed. I think Coke has definitely learned their lesson. But you can see, when you see companies fail, that when they don't take their brand equity into account when they're driving innovation, it causes failure for them. So let's talk about how brands actually come to life. And real quick, any questions before we jump into that? Any thoughts? Okay, we'll keep going. So, I mean, the first thing that people think of is a logo. That's, I mean, we all know that. I would contend that all the senses actually come into account when it comes to building your brand. If you've flown out of Northwest Arkansas Airport, it's a pretty small airport, as soon as you round security, like, you smell Auntie Anne's. And I've flown out of there enough that I can smell Auntie Anne's in any airport across the United States without seeing it, because I have a connection in my brain from that smell to Auntie Anne's. Harley Davidson, the sound of their exhaust is actually intellectual property for them. They protect that. That is, I'm not a motorcycle guy, but I mean, especially with like Bikes, Booze, and Barbecue, like, you guys all have heard this sound, and you know it when you hear it. That's a critical part of their brand for Harley Davidson. Chick-fil-A, like, you get great chicken sandwiches at Chick-fil-A, but at every Chick-fil-A restaurant I've ever been to in my life, I get great service as well. You guys have one on campus, right? Is the service as good on campus? Yeah, like, that is absolutely a part of their brand equity. The Ritz-Carlton, I've never stayed there, but I've heard that the service there is impeccable, and that is absolutely a part of their brand equity, and it's very intentional. It actually drives the value of their company as well. But I would say the most critical element of your brand, it's not the packaging, but it's actually the product itself. It's how you interact with the product. It's that experience. So whether it's Pappy Van Winkle which some people who are big into bourbon say it's really good, but it's not the best. But everyone who has any understanding of the category knows that Pappy is super hot right now and regarded as one of the best. Trader Joe's, Trader Joe's, I think, has a great experience in their grocery stores. But they have a really good product as well. And when you interact with that product, you're like, man, I get something this good at this price. That's part of their brand equity. Or Disney's another great example. Like that, for their advertising is really important. But what's really important for them is the experience of whether it's in the theme park or it's actually in the content that they create. Like that is the most critical element. So if you do all the other stuff right, but you get this stuff wrong, there will be a major issue with your brand, and it will not resonate with people. I'm curious, what are some of y'all's favorite brands and why?
Say Apple.
Yeah.
Like the phone.
Yeah.
Compared to Samsung, I think it's better.
Yeah. Because of the experience, or
Apple also does a lot with their advertising.
Yeah.
They kind of try to hit it home, whereas most people are like, hey, here's a phone, you should buy it.
Yeah.
Whereas Apple's like, let's get in their heads first and then present the phone.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone disagree with that? Any Samsung people? I love Apple as well. I've actually heard some people say that like their innovation is actually they're behind Samsung, but they do such a good job of that branding and the whole experience that like it's obvious that they're near $1 trillion company. What other brands do you guys
Craftsman.
like?
Craftsman tools,
Why is that?
lifetime warranty, and then that's really the big one. You can have them for 20 years, take them into Sears, and they'll replace them right then and there. And then they just hold up well. But
Yeah.
lifetime warranty is huge to retaining customers.
Any brands you guys really? Well, go ahead.
I was going to say Ben & Jerry's.
Yeah. Any brands you guys really dislike? Chevy. Why is that?
Because I don't think their cars are that high quality, and I think their commercials kind of patronism.
Yeah. Are you a Ford guy? No.
Japanese.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we may unpack those a little bit more as we get into this. So, branding is biology. So here's the part where I'm not an expert on brain function, but I know enough from a marketer's perspective to know how to utilize this. So, if you think about humanity, I think there's been about 7 generations that have been alive in the modern world. And if you think about how many generations prior to that were operating on the plains, in the savannah, wherever, there's hundreds and hundreds or possibly thousands of generations that have existed. And our brains are used to functioning more in this world and not in this world. Our brains are not adapted to functioning in this type of environment. That's just, as amazing as our brains are, that's just how we are built. So there's these mental shortcuts that we can use as marketers to get around how the brain works, and really cut to the point of driving recall and driving meaning with consumers and with shoppers. And that's the part we're going to get into, is how do you actually do that. But before we do that, and real quick, this is a quote from Douglas Van Pelt. He wrote this book called Unconscious Branding. It's pretty interesting. I would recommend it as a library checkout. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you buy it, but there's some really good reference material here if you've got a little bit of extra time. So, how do you access those biological shortcuts? Well, I think we all know that the brain operates and runs, and there's these synapses that are taking place all the time. And from what we know that I've read about, the way that we build memories is these synapses are making connections in our brain. And the more often that we drive a particular connection, like repeat a connection, the stronger the memory is and the more easily it is to access. So that repeat is really important to drive that connection in our brain. And something else that's pretty interesting about the brain is that it's 2% of our body weight, but it takes up 20% of our energy, which is really fascinating. Like, that's how important it is to how we function. Shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, but it's an interesting fact on how important the brain is. So let's talk about what those shortcuts are. So the first shortcut, and this is all about driving those connections, those synapses in the brain. The first shortcut is story. So who has heard of archetypes? The term archetypes in story. Archetypes are these original patterns that everyone recognizes, no matter what the story is. If you go back, you can go way back into history and you look at story, and everyone has these archetypes, and they're universal. So this guy named Carl Jung, who you all probably studied in like undergrad psychology, did all this work to understand what are these particular archetypes. And he came up with 12 of them. We'll dig into these in a little bit. But what's really fascinating, quick aside, is that Carl Jung did some of this original work on archetypes, identifying what they are. There's this guy named Joseph Campbell, who was this mythologist in the early 20th century. And he did some additional work to really define some more, like, he developed some more richness around these archetypes, and he particularly focused on the hero archetype. And a student of Joseph Campbell's was George Lucas. So you can actually, like, if you look at Star Wars and you look at the characters, particularly like Luke Skywalker, Luke Skywalker follows the exact pattern of the hero that Joseph Campbell laid out and came from the work of Carl Jung. So I'm going to connect this back to marketing here in just a second. But it's those elements of story that we as humans just intrinsically know. We'll talk about how brands use them. So let's take a look at the rebel archetype. So everyone has an image, a mental image of what a rebel is in their mind. May have something to do with someone on a motorcycle, maybe James Dean. Han Solo, he represents that rebel archetype. Robin Hood's another example of someone who was not going to conform to society and represents that rebel archetype. Any thoughts on brands that might leverage this rebel archetype?
Could we say Tesla?
There's an element of, there's absolutely an element of the rebel that Tesla has. Yeah.
The technology is pretty disruptive. It's changing.
Yeah.
Shaking up. It's nice.
There's probably a couple other archetypes that you might be able to say for them, but I agree that particularly because of Elon as well, like, he really exemplifies that rebel aspect. Any other thoughts?
Apple did their Be Different campaign a while back.
Yeah. There's, you could argue that's rebel. There's another archetype called the creator that most people think Apple falls within. And there's an aspect of the creator where you are not conforming to societal norms. Absolutely. So one of the best known rebel archetypes is Harley Davidson. So if you look at some of their advertising, if you want to fit in, take the bus, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that, blah blah blah. Like their whole brand is steeped in the rebel archetype. And again, like because they've always lived in this archetype, like it's created those memories in our mind, and they're really easy to access because we know the story. We know that in our mind we know the type of person that drives a Harley Davidson. It may be a little bit different, maybe your uncle drove one. My dad was an accountant, so I definitely did not, I wasn't close to the Harley culture. I had a perception of it that I've grown out of a little bit. But they've done a really good job of embodying that archetype. So we're gonna look at a few different examples of some of these archetypes and how brands leverage them. So if you go online and you look up brands and archetypes, you can start to see how different brands embody these archetypes. The North Face, Patagonia, almost all of the outdoor companies would fall within the Explorer. Nike, Under Armour, any of the sports or athletic brands, they're gonna leverage that hero archetype. Disney, as we talked about, they're the magician. Everything is magical. So let's look at a couple examples. So if you're taking notes, you might just say shortcut 1, define your archetype.
What's your deal? Oh, come on, man. You've been riding me all day. You're playing like Betty White out there. That's not what your girlfriend said.
Baby. Use Snickers. Better?
You're not you when you're hungry. The Snickers satisfies.
So their archetype that they go after is the regular guy or the everyman. What's really, and if you look at all their campaigns since they came out with this, it's all connects back to regular person, regular family, something that's very easy to associate with. But what's also really fascinating to think about is how that regular guy drives their innovation. So you would not see Snickers coming out with an ingredient with quinoa or something super innovative. Maybe innovative is not the term, but they're gonna come out with almonds and peanuts and it's gonna be variations like that, and that all ties back very intentionally to that regular guy, regular person archetype.
And it all comes back to you. You're gonna be remembered for the things that you say and do. You give a little love and it all comes back to you. You're gonna be remembered for the things that you say and do. You give a little love and it all comes back to you.
So their archetype that Coke goes after is the innocent, or this is Return to Paradise. So you see the goodness that comes out from Coke. So if you think even about polar bears, they've had their polar bear campaign for decades, or even Santa Claus. We owe a lot of how we as a society treat Christmas actually to Coca-Cola and work that they did in, I don't know, the 30s or 40s. But it's all about like returning to paradise, and they've continued to build off of this archetype. Let's look at one last one.
Dear candidate, unfortunately, you have not been accepted. You lack the right feet, turnout, torso length, and bust for ballet. And at 13, you are too old to be considered.
So, Under Armour leverages the hero archetype, and the hero is all about overcoming. And so, like a great story, she's now I don't know the ballet world, but she's very well known, very well respected in the ballet world, and they use her story to build their brand. So, again, think back to Luke Skywalker and all he had to overcome. Like, it's the exact same storyline, and we as humans just naturally connect with that underdog who overcomes and wins, and as a result, all these brands will leverage that archetype. So, first shortcut was define your archetype. Second shortcut is to create distinctive memory structures. So distinctive memory structures are things that they would be IP, something that you can protect. And usually most of the time it's going to be a visual thing. It could be, we talked about Harley Davidson, it could be the sound from the exhaust. But outside of the context of the brand, they're not going to mean much. But once you start to associate it with a brand, that's when they start to create a lot of value. So everyone knows what this is because we've seen it billions and millions of times. But prior to McDonald's being on the scene, this wouldn't mean anything. But they've turned that into a distinctive memory structure. Snapchat logo, again, like I don't have Snapchat, but I think a lot of people do. And it's really interesting when you look at particularly tech companies and their logos, by themselves they don't mean anything, but when it's right there on your phone, you have a lot of meaning associated with that. Johnny Walker logo. I'm realizing now that I have this, you guys may all think I'm an alcoholic, and I'm really not. But alcohol brands do a really good job with their branding. William Penn, Quaker Oats, Target, and then one more. And again, if you look at these elements, by themselves, they don't mean anything, but these brands have done a really good job of incorporating some element here. And oftentimes, they may even connect it back to their archetype. So, second step is creating a distinctive memory structure. Does this make sense what this is? Okay. It can be a part of your logo, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Third shortcut is a borrowed memory structure. And this is starting to get a little bit more advanced as far as utilizing this within brands. But basically, a borrowed memory structure is something that you can't own or protect, but if you use it in the right way and you use it enough, it actually becomes part of your brand. So there is nothing on here that Apple owns. I mean, they do own the obviously their earbuds, but that's literally just an outline. This is something that they've used enough times and they use enough in their campaign that you don't even have to see the logo and you associate it with Apple. You guys know what this is? Yeah. Again, aside from their logo and their packaging, there's nothing in this image that some other company could not use, but they've used it enough times and they've built it into their brand equity that you immediately understand that Find Your Beach or Life's a Beach, and you very quickly associate it with Corona because those memory structures have been built in our brains very intentionally. Fourth shortcut, which isn't really a shortcut, this is more of like this is where the deep work happens. But the fourth step is just be consistent. Like as you're building, like as you're creating your brand, you're building those memory structures. It is super critical to just be almost boringly consistent with it. So I see a lot of young companies that they really like. They may have a great someone who's really into marketing on their team, and they're changing their logo up like every 2 or 3 years, and that is like absolutely the worst thing you can do as a small company. Like you need to have someone help you develop that, do it well, and then just stick with it. We'll dive into that a little bit. But if you look at Coke, they've done a really good job over time of the shape of their bottle is part of their IP, and then the logo as well. Like they have been boringly consistent, and it's created a tremendous amount of value for them. BMW as well is another example with like the grill. It's something that like I never thought of until it was called out to me, but that's part of their like that design language is part of their intellectual property, and it's how you recognize a BMW from a ways away. And then as comparison, Pepsi, like I would argue they've done a terrible job with their brand equity. If you look at it over time, there's a reason that they are number 2 to Coca-Cola. And then this last step is defining what your brand compass is. I'll dive into this a little bit. Like if you're working on a startup, I would not worry about this step yet, but I would have it in the back of your mind that at some point, maybe once you get a marketing person on your team and you've got a viable product, then you can start thinking about this. But brand compass is really you're getting into what does your brand believe? What is that kind of universal need? This goes into Maslow's hierarchy that you're tapping into. What's the context of the category you're playing within? You're getting into your archetype. You're defining your broad memory structures, your distinctive memory structures, and then you're defining what your brand benefit is. And this is going to be really important to drive that consistency once you get to a certain size so that you can, everyone in the organization, locally, across the nation, across the world, has that same understanding of what the brand is all about and is using it consistently. There's some companies that use a brand pyramid. Actually, there's a lot of companies that use a brand pyramid. It's another method. I personally tend to think that like a brand compass just has a little bit more meaning, a little bit more explanation in it that ultimately is more useful for marketers. Any questions before we get into ROI?
So, you said that consistency is key.
Mm-hmm.
If you're developing a brand for the first time, where do you find that balance between consistency and making sure that what you have is something that you feel comfortable sticking with for a long time?
Yeah, like making sure it's right.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there's this book called How Brands Grow. The guy's name is Byron Sharp. So he's a professor out of Australia, I think Ehrenberg Bass, and he's done a really good job of like kind of cutting through all the BS of marketing and looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of data points to understand how brands actually grow. And so what he would articulate, and when I was at Mars, we had him on retainer, and like he did a lot of work with us, and so I kind of think like him because that's just where my training came from. He would articulate what's really important is to be distinctive, not differentiated, but have this distinctive element that people immediately recognize. And then he would argue that like over time, if you've used that enough, you create the meaning. Like it creates the meaning that you want it to have. And so it's about being distinct, and it's about just like it's about like being consistent with it. So I mean, I would like as you're developing something, I would look at the landscape of everything in your category, and I would work with the designer, and we'll talk about how to connect with one in an inexpensive way, and develop something that's super unique that just really stands out. So the interesting thing when you look at like Coca-Cola, like they didn't set out to create the brand. They set out to create a great product, and then they were just really consistent with it. They have learned and they've evolved along the way, and they've realized like, oh, maybe we can create this bottle shape. And so they've added that. Or we can use this like this very specific Pantone color of red, and then they've added that. But there's really about three things that make up kind of what we associate with the logo. Does that answer your
that
question?
makes sense. It's like you kind of, even if it doesn't feel right in the beginning, it could end up being right just based on the fact that you've developed the brand. Like you've built the value around it.
Exactly. And it's going to be very tempting, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's a bad thing, but like you can put a logo in front of a focus group, but if they have nothing to associate it with, like you're going to get some terrible answers. Like focus groups, have y'all had a chance to sit in any focus groups? As soon as you can, observe, because like people love to talk, people love to be asked specific questions, and so research design methodology is super critical that you don't drive to an answer that is really not that helpful. Any other questions? Okay, so ROI. So I'm gonna give you another example. So ROI, like as a marketer, as a brand person, like you're always asked for ROI. And there's so many things that go into it, and it's so hard to measure the value of brand over time that like this is a constant battle of like what's like defining what's your brand worth. So I'm going to give you another example of someone who did it poorly, and we'll see how valuable this is. Tropicana, I think we all are familiar with Tropicana orange juice. Everyone knows the orange with the candy striped straw. So I think this was back in 2006. By the way, they were owned, I think they're still owned by PepsiCo at the time. I think they're still owned by them. So they had this idea that like, yeah, we've got our brand equity, but we really want to start being associated with that final product. We have a great product, and we really want to bring that to life to consumers. And they actually had some really cool elements of it. Like even this was like the lid on the orange juice. It was shaped like the orange, and it had this tactile aspect to it. It was really pretty cool. And so they developed this packaging. This was the new packaging that they developed. Again, you can see it really highlights that beauty shot of the product. You can almost taste that orange juice. And this was what their lineup looked like that they went to market with. They launched, and then they lost $33 million in 54 days. And the reason was because everyone was looking for the orange with the straw in it. And you don't see that anywhere on the shelf. So they very quickly reversed course. They got their packaging lines back up and they went back to their old packaging. Obviously, a number of people lost their job from PepsiCo. The agency that brought this to them also is no longer in business, not surprisingly. So tremendous value associated with that. But if you ask the marketer, the CEO, the CFO, like, hey, what's the value of our equity? It would be really hard to practically say, $300 million. But they very quickly realized just how valuable it was when they changed it. Lance Armstrong. This is another good example of someone losing their value. I would say, like, we associate Lance with that hero archetype. I mean, overcoming prostate cancer, like, he had all these roadblocks that he overcame, and then when the whole doping scandal came out, I mean, his brand is worth very little right now, and he was everywhere at the time. And then one more Pepsi example. They came out with a campaign last year where they were trying to basically they were replicating a Black Lives Matter protest, and they were showing how Pepsi like brings everyone together, and they very, very quickly pulled this campaign because they were trying to make money off of an issue that was real to our society, and no one appreciated it. So I don't have anything against Pepsi, but they just have some great examples of how. One more example of how what they've done to their brand over time. So when do you guys? Quick time check. We're at 5:15. I'll go quick. So when do you need to start thinking about your brand? You've got to start. Back to this idea that you need to be thinking about product. Your brand and your product strategy are like peanut butter and jelly. So you need to. They are one and of the same. And where you need to focus your energy is really on what your product is, and let that drive your brand strategy. So, pour your energy into your product. That's where you need to focus. Let your product drive what your brand strategy is. It'll be pretty apparent what as you start to understand what those 12 archetypes are, it'll be pretty apparent what your archetype probably should be. Now, that does not mean that you have to do everything else, like the same archetype as everyone else in your category, but there's some categories where, like, if you have a construction company and you try to create an archetype of the innocent or the nurturer, it just may not work very well for you. Find your brand archetype. Leverage a professional to define that design language. You got to have these distinctive memory structures. Start out with just one, but design something that no one else has and that really stands out from the category. And then just leverage it consistently. You ultimately have to be the protector of your brand, and once you get that brand developed, like, get your energy back on your product. Continue your innovating. So, quick example. Say you're coming out with mountain bike tires, and you have the latest, greatest product out there that you want to bring to market. So, focus your energy to get this viable and out there, or on its way out there. Then you would sit down, define what your archetype is. There's a really good chance that if you're the mountain bike tire company, you're going to be an adventure archetype. But you could there's a few other archetypes you possibly could be. Find a designer to develop your brand equity and your logo, and then get your energy back on innovation. Like, if this is your company, that's where you need to be focused. That's where your energy needs to be focused. So, how do you actually? Well, we're going to come back here in just a minute because I want to make sure we cover working with a designer. So, having been in the agency world, I know a lot of graphic designers. So I actually had to try to find out, like, from people who don't know designers, like, who would you go to? So there's this great association, I think it's Association of International Graphic Artists.
American Institute of Graphic Artists.
Are you familiar with them?
Yes.
That's good. So I reached out to them a couple weeks ago and said, hey, I'm teaching this class. Like, what would someone do? And so they have a local chapter here in Fayetteville, and then or Northwest Arkansas, and then the university has a local chapter as well. And you can hop on their Slack channel. Anyone can get on their Slack channel. And if you had a project or something that you need help with, you could put it out on the Slack channel. They post on Facebook and Instagram. It's a great place to understand, like, events that they have coming. And then they said, like, just come to an event. Like, start talking to designers, and you'll and you can talk to a designer and say, hey, I've got this project. Here's the budget that I'm thinking, and you'll very quickly start to get a feel for like who would be interested. You can ask to see resumes, you can ask to see portfolios, but super easy way to access some designers. I don't know if you guys do anything with the school chapter, but they'd be a great.
They're going to have a portfolio review next year, so if you have any type of idea or concept that you want to run along some designers, they're going to be open to that next year.
Awesome. Yeah, I think they would be a great resource to get connected with. So, 9 minutes. This is going to be an interactive part. You need to find someone next to you or close by that you can talk with. We're going to put this into application. So here's the question. Think of your company, this idea that you have. What would your archetype be and why? What is just one simple way you could bring that to life? And then if you don't have a startup idea, like just take your favorite brand and try to say, here's what I think the archetype would be. So let's take 3 minutes, find someone that you're close to, and let's define what our archetypes would be.
Was something that so what would you place but you got that, and then they cite that. Just eat. This it's been like probably the last 6 years. Set marks. They start highlighting. They start digging back in the treasure trove. So you're seeing you're showing you where it would be. That was interactive. The stories that you made. So you take some it's coming right now,
kind of associated with the brand with the
you 30 more seconds.
Where we can, I gotta go to where it is.
All right. I'm curious. Productive conversation. I'd love to hear a couple examples. Anyone want to share? Come on.
Yeah, so we're more technologists. We make robots that are training the next engineers and coders, and the point of our product is it's accessible to any beginner, but can turn them into an expert for a low cost. So we went with the archetype of a creator, and we wanted to show any kid in any situation that they could be doing this too. And so I think the way we're going to do that is by creating like role models where they can see themselves as that kid doing it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
We discussed bridging between like actual businesses that are brick and mortar and stepping into the online field, and using both to drive business and make awareness through using the tech sector as well.
Very cool. Was there an archetype that makes sense for that?
Innovator works for it really well, only because you're bridging both worlds.
Yeah.
But it won't be for very much longer because this is the way everyone's going to have to go to keep competitive.
Yeah. Very good. Anyone else? I realize I forgot to flash up all the archetypes, so you guys may not have had access to all 12. Any other examples or any questions? Like, I can't figure this out.
If you're stuck between a couple that you as like the creator of the business could see happening,
Yeah.
how do you decide which of those you're going for? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you have to? Can you be more?
I think you can do anything you want to do. Seriously, if you're struggling, don't feel like you absolutely have to lock in, but maybe there's two that you know. Where I would go next is I would start thinking about innovation. As I think about innovating 2 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out, what's gonna create the most opportunity, and that's probably how I would think about it. Okay. Let's recap. Product. That's where you need to focus. Use that product and that innovation to define what your archetype is. Get professional help from a designer. Again, AIGA is a great resource. They've got a local chapter at the university as well, so take full advantage of that. And then once you do that, as you're thinking about the creator or the innovator, man, what are all the ways that I can infuse that into everything from my logo to the color usage to my advertising, even to could even come to life in the product instructions or the videos that you have on YouTube that showcase the product or the unboxing, things like that. You can start to see how that archetype can get infused into everything that you do, and then just be consistent. And then once you're there, focus on product. Yeah, get back to your innovation. So, why do startups need this? One, it's going to drive growth. It's going to focus your thinking on the things that are going to help you grow, and hopefully, it's driving sales and volume as well. It's going to drive a clear innovation strategy, which we would either call it the flywheel or that virtuous cycle going. Once you get one product out, and you can start to build more products that associate with that, that's going to drive your volume and margin and all those other things that ultimately drive your valuation as well. So it's fun stuff, but it's also super critical to the growth of your organization. Thank you. So it's literally 5:30 right now on the nose. Anyone is welcome to jump up and go, or I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have. But thank you so much for having me. This was really fun, and it's exciting to hear about all the things that you all are working on. So thank you. If there's any questions, you can ask me, or we can talk. We can come up here and talk as well.